We're continuing on with the word, and Psalm 119 speaks of the word as being our hope. So we're looking at hope. If we ever needed hope, it's now. Thousands of people commit suicide a year in the U.S. One article I read was called "A Tattered Safety Net." And I'd say that's how most of us feel in this world regarding work, health, relationships, and more. And when that net is torn wide open, some fall into a pit of despair without hope. So one verse in 119, the writer's asking God to remember his word, and he says, "For you have given me hope." Without the word and without hope, we will all perish. With the word, we always have hope. We recently sang the old hymn at church called "On Christ the Solid Rock I Stand, All Other Ground is Sinking Sand." And that's so true. Jesus is the rock that doesn't roll. He's the sand that doesn't shift. And we also recently watched a movie called The Abyss, where the ground started swallowing up an entire town. Talk about no hope. A few verses later, there's another verse, a prayer for those who fear God to rejoice when they see him because they've put their hope in God's word. That's a cool request. What if fellow believers, when they're with us, start to rejoice simply because we are people of hope? It's not fun to be around those in despair. It's not easy to be desperate in the pit. In fact, we might end up falling all in the pit together if we all try on our own. And the only way to avoid the pit of despair is by observing where we place our hope. The word is so often contrary to our circumstances. It says he will provide, he will heal, and he will rescue, yet we don't see it. So if our hope is in circumstances changing, we will be miserable. But when our hope is in the character of God, then rejoicing can take place on the worst of days. But let's get real here. There are days when our souls faint, as the writer says. And he has that prepositional word that comes though, and he says, "But I've put my hope in your word." There are days when our souls faint. And in that passage, the writer speaks to his soul and gives it a question and a command in another verse in the Bible. It says, "Why are you so downcast, my soul? Put your hope in God." There will be days when we feel downcast for a number of reasons, and sometimes we don't even know why. And we will have to speak, sometimes verbally, to ourselves and say, "Put your hope in God." Remember when kids stand on the pool and they want to jump in the pool, but they're afraid, and the father says, "Jump, I'll catch you." Kids are fearful, terrified, and unable to even enjoy swimming or the water until they take that leap, telling themselves to jump, knowing their dad's arms will catch them and hold them above the water. That's sort of like what we do when we tell our souls to place our hope in God. His arms are out, well open, telling us to trust, even though the water is huge, overwhelming, and scary. He's with us and he won't let us drown. The writer proclaims that God is his refuge and shield as he's learned to put his hope in his word. And he asks God to not let his hopes be dashed. We all have hopes, for example, for a fun vacation, only to fall ill and not get to go. Hopes of a good time dashed. We have hopes of our kids growing up and fulfilling their dreams, only they hit a huge bump in the road and they veer off and crash. Hopes dashed. We place our hope in a freshly planted garden full of herbs and flowers, only to encounter a storm or a freeze or a drought or heat, and overnight everything's gone. Hopes dashed. Hopes rise and dash to the ground, much like a kite on a windy day. We run excitedly with the tail in the wind and throw up the kite, and it soars. Then it hits a limb and the wind dies and the kite crashes. We've all done it, we've all seen it, we've all experienced it. But God is not a God that dashes hope. He sent his son Jesus to offer hope to a dying world. He gave us forgiveness, forgotten sins to never be brought up again. Hope and peace in our minds and hearts forever. No hopes dashed. And those things that we're praying for and believing for and hoping for, we can place them in his hands, jump in his arms, and rest, knowing that our hope is him and we are unable to be rooted up or blown away. The last reference in this chapter to the word says, "I rise before dawn and cry for help. I've put my hope in your word." I think it's the most hopeless hours right before dawn, when it's the very darkest. That's the darkest part of the night. But he hears our cries. He's not deaf. His arm is not short. And I think the other hardest part about trusting in God is the ambiguity we think is there. On the one hand, he says he'll heal the sick and raise the dead and protect us. But in the reality of life, we get so sick. We watch people die and we feel attacked. And while we know in our heads that God's ways are higher and he knows things we don't know, we still want him to make things right for us. But he also says we will have struggles and trials. I've mentioned this before, but when we place our kids in a game or on a team and send them on a field, we would never think of sending them ill-equipped without the uniform and the gear they need to win. But we know that there are opponents out there, fierceful opposition, but we still send them. And it's because we know the goodness of character that comes from working on a team, getting knocked down and even losing, because it tempers and tampers with us and teaches us to grow and mature into these capable, successful adults. And yet that's a tiny playing field compared to the field we're playing on, going toward eternity with him. God knows his word gives us hope and we can jump in the water. He holds us. This world gives us dashing to the ground and defeat and strong winds, but everything works together for good. This hope we have is alive and real and effective in giving us the hope of his word. And when we're here in his arms and trusting he's got everything under control, all is well. All is well with our souls.